these nuggets that we're going to share with you really fall into these three academic areas. So we have John and I both have a really interesting interest in behavioral economics, impacts of that, neuroscience and particularly neuroleadership and the impact that has on the work that we do, and then finally some applied behavioral science principles. So again, as John said, we're going to take you through 5. What I just did is I passed out what we call the behavior cards. So those we'll be referring to as you go through. When we hit the Kahoot game, you can use those for reference, and then we have an application at the end where you're going to actually decide which one of those behaviors might fit with the example that we're going to give you. So John, with that, let's go to the behavioral economics.
Okay, so buzzing through these, the first principle that we're going to talk about is fast versus slow thinking. By show of hands, how many people know what that means? Okay, so in the neuroscience realm, our brains, we have an old brain and a new brain, let's say. The old brain is pre-wired to do things quickly. It's sort of our base responses, the things that we're conditioned to do. We respond to things like hunger, we eat, right? Very primal kinds of inputs that we respond to. We have a new brain, we'll call it the frontal lobe, but that's where we think about complex problems. We weigh outcomes and we decide. And the reason I have a picture of McDonald's up here is because I find myself at McDonald's way more than my brain should allow me to be at McDonald's. We all know that it's not the greatest thing for us, but yet we show up at McDonald's or Burger King or whatever your favorite is. In California, it's In-N-Out, but we show up at those places even though we know that's not the best choice. Why is that? Well, a lot of times our brains are programmed to just respond to those urges unless our new brain jumps in and says, wait a minute, let's weigh out the choices. How good is this for us? How not good is this for us? The same is true when it comes to change. We have to think about architecting choices in a way that doesn't bias us against it. So if you think about the grocery store and you go in the grocery store and you're walking out, what's right there where you check out? All kinds of candy, all kinds of soda, right? And we respond, we pick it up. Did you stop and think about, is this really good for me? No, you just respond to it, right? When change comes, resistance is something we always talk about. It's something that we just do because it's the unknown, right? How do we make, if you think about this principle, how do you make change more certain so that people can react with their old brain and just say, yep, let's go, as opposed to invoking the new brain and having to weigh out the choices. You know, what should I do about this? Also, it might be that we take and we force people into that system 2 thinking, the new brain, and we say, okay, everybody stop. We're going to talk about this for a minute so that you don't just knee-jerk resist, right? It can come in handy in a lot of different places, but thinking about the fast and slow brain and which one people react to the most, right? We react to stereotypes, that's the fast brain. In-group, out-of-group thinking, that's the fast brain. Complex decision analysis, that's the slow brain. Requires a lot more effort. The second principle in behavioral economics is simplifying complex choices. We have lots and lots of choices these days. And there's a picture of a camera up here because I had the experience of going into a Best Buy and I wanted a camera. And this is a number of years ago, and I just grabbed the guy and I said, I need a camera. And he said, well, I can get you there in 3 questions. And I thought, this is going to be interesting. I said, so question number 1, he said, you want rechargeable batteries or regular batteries? And I thought, what? And he said, just go with me on this, rechargeable or regular? And I said, okay, I want regular. And he said, okay, next question is, how big do you want those pictures to be? TV screen or 8 by 10 or bigger on a print? And I said, 8 by 10 or bigger. And so then he came down to the last question and he said, you know, do you want portable or do you want something professional? And I said, I want portable. He steps over, he picks up a camera, he said, this is the one you chose. And I said, well, why not that one, the one next to it? And he said, that one has rechargeable. And I said, well, what about that one? I like the way that one looks over there. And he said, well, that one only produces a 4 by 6 picture when you print it. And I was amazed, there must have been 30 cameras. But when we help people simplify complex choices, it makes it easy for them to go through the process. Sometimes when you look at these change programs that we create, there's like 100 choices, there's 50 different diagrams, and it's no wonder executives don't have time to pay attention. They just can't. They're trying to figure out where they fit in that and what they do with it, and they just can't see it. So if we can simplify those, that helps the brain and the person get engaged to go along with those a little bit more. So we've got structure, limiting the number of choices, predetermined criteria, or a defined decision process helps us get to those decisions quicker. That's true with the project and it's true with change.
I had a scenario for this last week where we were doing some messaging to a broad audience, and you asked people for feedback on how would you wordsmith, does it work, and you kind of open up the oyster, right? Instead of saying, hey, we have this much room, would you like option A or option B? I'll take option B, we're done. So just narrow it down, make it a simple choice, makes it really good. So let's do a couple neuroscience ones. So leverage the social orientation of the brain. So think about scenarios that you find particularly insightful, particularly attached to. Oftentimes those are social by nature. And the brain, Michael was talking about this morning, how you take the breath, pause, get your prefrontal to engage. You have preconceived biases, if I can use that word, positive, negative, and those things, as you're going through neuroscience, trying to connect things to what people do, but they all come back to social nature. So let's click once, John. So some of the big things here is, our brain, again, is wired for social interaction, and those social reinforcements are the things that connect us with what we do. Rewarding using SCARF. So how many of you have heard of SCARF? I see heads nod, so that's good. So those nuggets within neuroscience: status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. Those 5 dynamics do change over time, and as you're thinking about how do people interact with this, people may look at fairness differently today than they did 3 months ago. If you're going through an acquisition, a divestiture, a reorganization, how do leaders look at those things differently than how the normal audience does? Consider those things as you're thinking about how would I architect a good behavioral approach to the change. And the next one, John. This one I think a lot of people know, right? Tell a story. So what do you remember from what Michael said this morning in his keynote? What did he talk about? Mindset. Remember he talked about his dad? His father, right? He said, let me tell you a story, right? And as soon as you do that, all of a sudden you're creating empathy, you're bringing people and bringing connections to that. So I think storytelling as a whole has a true neuroscience connection as well. Let's look at the details. So stories prime us to create connections, right? That empathy thing for me is huge. So if you connect the empathy through that story that people can relate to, it really helps with the journey. Those emotions trigger the chemicals. So neuroscience is all about the chemistry that's happening, and so those emotions will help do that. And certainly context is improved and enhanced when you use storytelling. John?
So the last one of these, we did 2 from behavioral economics and 2 from neuroscience. This last one is good old behaviorist, focusing on reinforcing a few behaviors that drive results. If there's one thing that we see when we look at change plans that have reinforcement in them, is characteristically there's about 10 things that you're reinforcing. And we have had experience with a lot of organizations who say, look, it's really important that we change. Here's the 45 behaviors that you need to exhibit in order to change. And that's on top of whatever their performance objectives are, which is on top of the company values, and it's just too much. So when you think about reinforcing, applying behavioral science, we've learned that there's a maximum number that people can sort of digest. And if we're going to reinforce and do it meaningfully, we've got to focus on the very few things that are meaningful to us. So If you think about, I have 7 kids, so I have lots of fodder for experimentation. And I'm not sure sometimes if they're the experiment or I'm the experiment for them. But we had a child that was really upset about a decision we made. And asking them to leave the room, what does your teenager do when you ask them to leave the room? They stomp out of the room, they slam the door, they get to the other side of the door, they kick something and something falls off the wall, right? And the first thing my wife does is go from 0 to 100. She's like, I'm gonna go and, you know, and I said, stop. He did exactly what we asked him to do. And she turned around and looked at me, and I thought my life was gonna end. And I said, dear, you said leave the room. He did. Let's be happy with that, right? That's easy in that scenario. When you tell an executive that his job is to reinforce the change, you have to think that through, because they might reinforce the change by firing everybody that doesn't want to do it, or they might reinforce the change by publicly humiliating somebody, or they might reinforce the change by standing up once in a year and saying, I think that's a good idea. So we have to be specific, and we have to focus on a few things that we want them to do to really drive the change. Maybe it's stand up and say something, but maybe it's as simple as the behavior we want is the first question you ask your direct reports is, what have you done this week to change your culture? That might be the simple thing that you reinforce and ask about over and over, right? And that drives behavior change. So it's because it requires focus and effort. Not only can they not digest 15 things, but we as facilitators of change cannot follow up on 15 things for 100 people or 1,000 people. Narrow to the few things that drive results, pilot test to make sure that you're really getting at the right kinds of behavior and there's not unintended consequences for that, and then monitor and measure. Occasionally in some cultures, a very simple instruction will go south, not because, you know, it's just because the cultural overlay on it means something different. And before you roll out an enterprise-wide behavior program, it'd be nice to know that you're really going to get the kind of results from that you want, similar to the CEO. And follow up on that. I'll give you one example. We worked with a vice chairman, and he said, I've been a great sponsor of the program. And we said, I'm not so sure, which is a very courageous and career-limiting moment. And so he said, look, I'll prove it. And we said, great. Why don't you make a tick in your planner, just a mark on the page, every time you talk about this? And he said, that's easy. I'll do it. And you guys will see that you're giving me a bad rap. So 2 weeks later, we show up, and we said, hey, time for a touch point. Can we just start by looking at your planner? And he said, oh yeah, for sure. I've been talking about it a lot. And we went through the planner, and there was 1 tick in 2 weeks. And he's like, I know I talked about it more than that. And we said, great, you know, do you remember a day or a meeting that you did? Maybe you forgot to mark it. And as we went back through his calendar, there wasn't one. He just had been thinking about it, but not talking about it. And that's the kind of thing that's a simple reinforcement that we can work on that helps drive behavior change. So just a word about these cards. There's nothing magic about them. They're sort of fun. I use them from time to time to get at what I think our intent was, which is when I encounter a problem, and we only went through an individual problem here, but in a longer class we go through organizational issues that we could address with some of these. But I use them as a bit of a flip card to say, all right, this is what science has told me is important about changing behavior. I've got a problem. Let me flip through these cards and just see, is there something here? Because all too often I revert to the things that I know and the things that I've done, which may or may not be appropriate. And if we're not careful as practitioners, we can get into that kind of rut. We just tried to choose a couple of those and then pick something that we thought was easily applicable to all those. If we do a 2-hour session, we choose 10, and it depends on the problems that organization is facing. We look at the case study and say, what's an applicable case study and what might apply, and let's give them some practice with how to apply those. And those are 15 of 100, right? That we just happened to put in cards because our graphic guy could make nice little drawings on them. But so we hope that that's interesting to you, that you'll think about how do I apply some of the science, some of the behavioral science, and there's more and more every day, to the problems that we face. And force yourself maybe into a bit of a process that's a system 2 thinking, not to just revert to the thing that we've always done. If we're good practitioners, we're a lot like doctors, right? Who have to study their craft. They stay up on current studies. You don't want a doctor who's still living with what he did 20 years ago. You want somebody who's current and focused and knows how to apply recent research. That's sort of our plea here, is to figure out how to help us as practitioners apply those things in behavioral sciences that can really help us solve problems, and we can bring that to the people that we work with and say, look, this isn't just a nice idea. This is rooted in research and study and some practical behavior. And so we hope that that's been a little bit fun, a little bit interesting, and that you learned something from it. We also hope there's something you can take away on Monday morning.